Good morning, everybody, to Choose Inclusion. So glad to have everybody back today. And as always, I'm thrilled to have my co hosts, Miss Nina Ubaldo. Good morning.
Morning, everyone, or
Hi.
afternoon, or wherever you happen to be when you're listening to this.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Hello.
Yeah. And this morning, team, you guys know what an honor. We have somebody who's coming back. The first time we had Mr. Travis Stovall on our podcast, he was running for mayor. And since then, we found out that he won by a landslide in Gresham, Oregon. And we are so happy to have you back, Mr. Mayor. Thank you so much for coming back to the Choose Inclusion podcast. I can talk today.
Well, thank you. Happy to be here, Mike and team. Of course, that landslide was by 13 whole votes. So it's kind of joking when we say landslide because 13 votes means every vote really does count.
Well, and I think I would love to hear a little bit about that process, because you were right in the middle of it, and obviously recounts and all this kind of stuff were a big part of this, past presidential election. What was your experience, particularly as a Black person running for office? What was that experience like?
Great question, UB. I think we start with just the process. I mean, the process of running for a public office is interesting. I mean, there's an entire ecosystem that supports our political infrastructure, and it's fascinating. And I got to see it intimately. We had to go through a period of time where all the votes had to be counted, which was a time period of roughly about two weeks, and then there's another time frame where the contested ballots could be counted, and that's a further process that needs to go on. And then because the race was so close at 13 votes, we had to go through a recount, and that recount took another week. So from our election day of November 3rd to the actual time when I knew was a month. So there was a lot of waiting and a lot of additional work. Again, tapping the ecosystem and infrastructure in the U.S. election system was just fascinating. And my experience with the recount, I got to actually see it in person. And I can tell you that based on what I saw, a highly credible process, phenomenal checks and balances that exist, at least here in Oregon, that thoroughly impressed me. And, the journey as a Black man going through this process was fascinating and interesting also, because there's a lot of balance that we have to go through as we're doing what we consider to be campaigning. The campaigns and those efforts, we want to be transparent. We want to be honest. We want to be forthright. And sometimes, your opponents can use that against you if you're honest and forthright. But that's the way I am, and that's the way I will continue to be. And frankly, when you're especially in our town, we've got roughly 4 to 5% of our population are African American. In Oregon, historically and currently, has a very low Black population. Statewide, I believe that number sits currently around 3 to 4%. So it's relatively small. And so to be able to be elected into a position as mayor, fourth largest city in the state, second largest city in the metropolitan area, is absolutely an honor, but it's also humbling. Because now we're tasked with the balance of ensuring that we are moving social and racial equity forward, but also considering the entire community. We've got, and once you include additional minorities, people of color, BIPOC communities in the number, we go north of 30%, approaching just under 40% of the population here, which leaves 60% of dominant culture individuals in our community. And how do we make sure that while we're looking at the racial and social justice and equity question, we're also considering how do we balance the efforts, the plight, the challenges that exist for all of our community members. And that's challenging. That's not something that comes easy.
I think what's interesting about when people think about politics, they're so focused on the federal level, right? Like, what are the federal level changes? But the biggest impact happens at the local level. And I love the fact that you're talking about social equity in terms of what you can do as the mayor. Can you share with our audience some of the plans that you have for the city that you can actually do as the mayor?
Well, Nina, that's a phenomenal question, because ultimately, as you and there's a saying that all politics are local. And so you just touched on that. And at some point, we would wish that we would not get into the quote unquote politics of things and really do what's right, for our cities, for our municipalities. Those are, that's the passion, that's the desire. But sometimes the politics gets in the way, the true politics gets in the way of being able to accomplish some of the things that we want to accomplish because of some of the parochial ideals that come to the conversation. To that end, it's interesting. I was just having a conversation yesterday, kind of on a national scale about poverty, and that's one of the passions that I have and always had. How do we reduce poverty? How do we give people the opportunity to go from poverty to prosperity? And with that being an underlying kind of focus, you asked the right question. What can we do? And we know that poverty exists on a significant percentage in the BIPOC minority community. So if we're going to crush poverty, we've got to make sure that we understand how to address some of those things. And so what can I do as mayor? Well, we know that the two most critical impediments for people achieving prosperity, the very first one is access to affordable childcare. The second one is transportation. I had the opportunity to be on the TriMet board, which is our regional transit system here in Portland, the Portland metropolitan area. I was on that board for 9 years and had the opportunity to help that organization get into great financial shape. But we also did some things. You talk about equity. One of the areas that we saw problems is that we had issues with what we call fare evasion. So if someone gets on one of our vehicles on one of our light rail trains and they don't pay the fare, and ultimately they get caught by one of our fare inspectors. Well, we noticed that in some of those harshest cases of discipline, many of those, as a higher percentage, were African-American males. And it was a criminal offense for fare evasion. So these individuals didn't pay $2.50, and eventually they've got a criminal record. And we saw that as something that was incredibly damaging, because that if you've got that criminal record, it gets more difficult to pull yourself from poverty to prosperity. And so we went to our legislature and got them and worked hard to work with the legislature, which they were absolutely open for. And we actually decriminalized fare evasion. There's still fines and penalties for fare evasion, but it does not become a criminal offense. So it's those types of things that we also need to be looking at. How do policies impact folks that are BIPOC and people of color in ways that we don't always know, because we don't exist sometimes on the same scale, on the same level. The lived experience isn't there to be able to see that intuitively. And you mentioned, I think Mike mentioned the fact that DEI are things that sometimes happen at a scale that doesn't really impact the way we want it to impact. And in that case, we don't want to exist in a space and a place where DEI gets bolted onto the conversation. We want it to be intuitive. We want it to be natural and organic in the conversation. And when you have people who have lived experience, they can bring that naturally.
I so love how you go from like it's the 4 or 5 conversations nationally that at the local level that they still talk at the federal level, and it's education, it's healthcare, it's transportation, it's employment. Like these aren't there's no rocket surgery to what people need, and especially marginalized communities. I'd love to hear, if you don't mind, talking a little bit about your strategy for affordable childcare.
So, there's actually here in the Portland metro region, the region just passed last November some legislation that allows for free Head Start and those types of programs, which I am a huge fan of. I got the opportunity to go to Head Start when I was 4 years old, and I believe it gave me a tremendous jump on life. In education, which has benefited me until today, through today. So ultimately, that's one of the things so that just passed. It's things like that will allow us to ultimately, I believe, start to work with the population of individuals who struggle with being able to access that affordable childcare. Other things that if the moment we as a community take the opportunity to align our efforts better with our investments, we have a tremendous opportunity to have a positive impact overall. So you think about libraries, you think about organizations like the Boys and Girls Club, we think about community colleges and things like that. How do we leverage and align those efforts to get the best outcome, which helps us deliver, free or affordable childcare? And so as we're looking at those things, I've already had some great conversations with folks here in leadership at the school, in the school districts, at the community college, and workforce training. All of these individuals, we've already had some initial conversations to start to focus our efforts on, things like that, foundational things that then give these individuals the opportunities they've never had. I know a young mom who's single and has 2 children, and she works locally and makes about $18 an hour. Her childcare is roughly $12 an hour. I mean, we instantly all can see the challenge that she's going to have to raise herself from poverty to prosperity. And it's challenging. And of course, it's even more challenging in COVID because now the children would have been in school, which would have alleviated some of that. And now they're not at school, they're at home, digitally taking education. And so we've got to be aware of those challenges that exist for folks on that lower socioeconomic rung.
I'm glad you actually brought up COVID, Mayor. I was curious on, again, you're taking on a leadership role during, like to say it's unprecedented times, right? How is this, adding to your plate? Like, and I'd love to hear some thoughts, some strategies that you're thinking about at this point in time because of this digital pandemic time.
So, it's amazing. We've been able to, there's a lot of things that we've now been able to do, both privately and publicly, in regards to responding to the challenges of the pandemic. And there are things that I think are going to change the fabric of how we do things going forward, into perpetuity. And so I think some of the strategies that we've now seen with the pandemic are actually going to be beneficial digitally as we go forward, especially for inclusion, because transportation is another critical problem that we have for folks who are challenged socioeconomically or economically, and the ability to actually help them, move up through the digital distribution of opportunity is going to improve. Now, to that end, we've got to ensure that broadband is available. How do we make sure? I mean, we have all of these things, that kind of have the ability to kind of cascade and domino and grow, if we don't take care of them or if we don't supply the right resource. And what I mean by that is that, children who are in households that don't have broadband capabilities are now falling behind the educational achievement curve. And so how do we make sure that we're thinking about these things as we further implement digital technology because of the pandemic, but we also do that because we can be more efficient and have a high level of distribution of educational opportunities, training, those type of things through digital inclusion opportunities. When we do that, we've got to make sure that we've got that foundation in place for those who are most in need. So that's the thing. I mean, we've got to be thinking kind of comprehensively about that. But I think it's the digital distribution of education and opportunities and work opportunities is going to be tremendous because so much of our historical employment opportunity has come through our zip code. The closer you are to a location where you can get a high paying job, the better off you are. But those close in opportunities for housing and home purchases are pretty significant in cost. Well, now, since we've got the digital distribution, decentralization of workforces, I think we've got a much better opportunity for, again, inclusion through the digital distribution of all the things I just referenced.
One of the things I wanted to touch, so it's kind of taking this back a little bit to the national level, but because all of this that you're talking about really it's amazing how it can apply to organizations, right? And people trying to do this work, this diversity, equity, and inclusion work in their company. But something you mentioned when we were talking about the presidential election, and because it's interesting, right? You look at the history of presidents, and it's these white men from the dominant community in this country. But I'd love your perspective on that as it relates to President Biden, and hopefully what we can see happen from a change perspective, and how that might apply to sort of the same demographic that we see in organizations, right? The white male, older white men running the majority of these companies. But where's the silver lining in that?
Well, the silver lining starts, I think there's, of course, a moral, ethical conversation to be had every single moment, but there's also a financial and economic, component to everything that we just referenced. There's been tons of research that has actually identified that companies and organizations that have more diversity produce a higher earnings per share. This has been studied year over year, and it's always been the case. So it's not just an ethical, moral conversation that we need to be having, but it's also an economic conversation we need to be having. Furthermore, we also know, and I believe it was JP Morgan that did this research, we know that we've missed out on $16 trillion of GDP opportunity over the last 20 years because of deep discrimination. $16 trillion. I believe that's $800 billion annually over the last 20 years. That's tremendous. Think about if we had that into our economy, how would that lift many of the disadvantaged folks within our communities to a much higher level? They also found that over the next 5 years, we can add $1 trillion back to our GDP annually over the next 5 years. It's a $5 trillion impact if we have the ability to crush discrimination, specifically racial discrimination in our country. So on a global scale, that's highly impactful because of economic influence. So we have economic influence, and if we have economic influence, then we also have the ability to talk about democracy. And democracy is important, as we've seen it in our country, and that's what's critical. If we don't have that economic influence, we don't have the ability to be at the forefront in leadership of looking at democracy as, how we want to lead our country, and how we feel it's very important to have individuals engaged in the conversation. And so that leads to the idea of President Biden and his opportunity, being a dominant culture individual. And I truly believe that he has the ability and opportunity to do some incredible things. I think, I think he has the ability to lessen some of the fears that folks bring, to the conversation, to the various discussion. And I believe that if he does a great job of articulating what I just shared about the economic impact, along with the social and the ethical and moral positive impacts of crushing discrimination, we can go a long ways, because ultimately that is the right thing to do on all of those components that I just referenced. And I believe if he can do a great job of articulating the benefits to our country, we'll get some significant movement.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, that translates directly to, the what organizations can do, but it also, it also emphasizes the fact that it has to start with leadership, right? Any of these initiatives related to diversity and inclusion, there has to be a leadership taking control of that and making it a priority. Otherwise, it's just, another check the box kind of thing that a few people are managing, but it never truly takes. And so I think it's such a great example and such a great way to lead as we continue to see these conversations around inclusion and diversity take priority finally. Sadly, it took what it took last year, but I do see us on this path of getting there, right? Like, and really finally having these conversations. So
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it does take leadership. It takes leadership, and in the political space where a lot of this work happens, it takes what we call political will and then political capital. I mean, both of those things are required. And you mentioned leadership. to effectively lead, I think we've got to have the political capital and respect to be able to have folks allow us to lead them. If we don't have that, then we have very little progress that we can move forward. And so we've got to provide and we've got to establish that leadership. At the same time, folks want to be involved and engaged, which we absolutely want to have. But there's also the balance between what I consider to be authoritative decisions and consultative decisions, and knowing the difference. And sometimes, as leaders, we're called to make authoritative decisions. And many times we are called to make consultative decisions where we are engaging individuals and folks into the conversation. And I think sometimes some of that can get mixed up. And there's some misunderstandings of what we're asking, but it's critical. I mean, I think it's critical to have the correct balance as we talk about leadership. What does leadership really look like? And it's just fascinating when you're going through the campaign. Folks are asking you many times specifically, what are you going to accomplish? While at the same time they're asking, well, but we want to be included in the conversation. So if I give you direct things that I'm going to do right now, even before I get into office, how do you get an opportunity to inform exactly what you feel like needs to be done? And so you've got this dichotomy that you're struggling with of, okay, I want to be visionary, while at the same time, I want to listen, I want to engage. And folks are holding you accountable to, oh, you need to do this or you need to do that. But we also have to combine the efforts that I just referenced in the consultative and the authoritative. So as community, we can get to the best outcome. So yeah, I mean, it's complex to manage and lean into, but we have to do it. And that's where the political will comes in. We've got to have the political will to do the right thing.
Well, this has been a freaking amazing conversation. It's so good to catch up with you, and congratulations on everything.
Hey, Ubaldo.
Yeah, Mike.
I've got one last question, if that's all right. I got to know how is your cycling going?
Oh, what's cycling?
Yeah.
It's a funny question that you asked, Mike, because just the other day, I walked by I have two bicycles. I've got a cyclocross and a road bike, and I walked by them and I just shook my head because I was like, oh my goodness, I cannot wait to get back on the bike. So I actually haven't ridden in months.
I kind of thought so, based on running for office, running a company, you have this thing called a family, all those kind of things. But I know last time you had described yourself to me, which I really appreciated. Again, and you said you're more of a Clydesdale. So when you get up on the bike, right, you don't look like all the other bikers out there. So I had to ask, Mr. Mayor.
Yep. Yeah, no, I can't wait to get back on the bike. I literally am just longing to get back out there and hit the road.
Awesome. Well, I think I had told you I have family in Vancouver, Washington, so we fly into that area quite often. And when I do, hopefully you have 15 minutes to have a cup of coffee with me, my friend. And really so happy for you. I really am, Mr. Mayor.
Absolutely. Well, yeah. If you're ever out here, Mike, don't hesitate to let me know. Would love to grab that cup of coffee. Of course, sadly enough, one of my favorite coffee shops didn't make it through the pandemic, but I'm sure I will be able to find another place that can measure up. So, yeah, whenever you head off this direction, we'll absolutely grab that cup of coffee.
Awesome. Well, we might all take you up on that, actually.
Excellent. Come on
that
out.
would be wonderful. It'd be great to see you. Well, yeah, thank you again. Amazing conversation. And, as always, Mike, Nina, thank you. And thank you, the Choose Inclusion audience. Check us out on chooseinclusion.com. And there's a bunch of streaming sites that we're a part of. So thank you all very much, and take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Hi, everyone.